right? So welcome to this training session. So we're going to be talking about scientific communication to various audiences. We're starting with the assumption that students are learning from their major professor about how to do technical presentations and technical writing. So manuscripts, for example, and presentations at scientific meetings. So we've got a variety of other possible audiences here, and we have a subject area representative / expert for each of these. And the exemplar documents were circulated before the meeting. Once Ali gets started, I'll put the link to that folder in the chat in case anybody missed that. Feel free to put any questions that come up during the presentations directly in the chat, or save those for the end, or use that Google link that we provided. I'll put the link to that in the chat as well. We will be making the slides that are presented today, putting those in the folder for shared access. And so, this should be relaxed. And we're going to be trying to have like a monthly lunch and learn as part of the Chemurgy program. Dr. Rule's been working on trying to schedule those. And so, we hope these can be relaxed events. Show up, eat your lunch during the activity, right? So we're all friends here, right? Okay, I'm going to hand it over to Ali, who's going to talk about communicating with the public. Please go ahead.
Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is share my slides, and I'll ask if someone can confirm that they are able to see it. That would be greatly appreciated and helpful in presentation mode. Okay. So
looks good.
Yeah, you can see it?
Yes.
And it's in presentation mode for you?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So my talk today is about communicating with the general public. I'm Ali Salem. I'm the Associate Vice President for Research in the Office of the Vice President for Research, and I'm also the Bigley Chair and Professor of Pharmaceutical Sciences. I serve as the institutional PI on the NSF EPSCoR program, which has a wide range of research and educational and training programs geared towards promoting biomanufacturing in the state. So today, I'm going to be really focused on not what we do in terms of scientific papers, but rather communicating with the general public. And I'll give an overview of why that's important, what the best approaches or strategies could be within the constraints of time that I have allocated. And I'll welcome any questions. So the first thing I would say is that there's a couple of things to keep in mind about the general population. 2/3 of US adults don't have a bachelor's degree. And that means that they have very likely not taken undergraduate level chemistry classes. And this comes from census data in 2023, but also NSF statistics that were provided on elementary and secondary mathematics and science education programs in 2018, where they carried out a survey. So you can see the sort of breakdown of who has diplomas and all the way through to advanced degrees. 1/4 of high school students have not taken chemistry. And if they did take chemistry in high school, a lot of them don't remember it. And so that's another factor that we have to take into consideration. In fact, the average age of Americans is almost 40. So if they had taken that class, it was going to be over 20 years ago, and their knowledge will be 20 years out of date. And this data comes from NSF statistics from 2018, again, looking at elementary and secondary school mathematics and high school course taking. 1 in 10 Americans, that's 23 million people, are non-native English speakers. Most English classes don't cover chemistry terms, like the kind of things that we think about in terms of ionic equations or balancing equations, or looking at the various structures that you can have and how those bonds form. And so we need to assume that when we're talking to the general public, that they don't have a strong grounding in chemistry or its vocabulary. And so what I'm going to do is to present you with some 5 recommendations, focus recommendations for you to help reach them. And I'm always providing references for my data. This data comes from the census data in 2022. So the first thing we need to do is to use language that the general population uses. And so when you're communicating with the general public, you really want to ditch the jargon. And here is an example from me where I've been jargony and where I have then pivoted to not being jargony for the general public, and I'll show you that. So in the materials that were provided to you by the team here, you had an example of an AAPS abstract, American Association for Pharmaceutical Sciences abstract, and then a corresponding article that I had published in The Conversation that was geared to the general public. And you can see even in the title, this is the same topic, but in my title for the abstract, I've got respiratory and genomic effects induced by phosphine gas exposure, insights from mouse models to identify therapeutic targets. That is not geared towards a general public population. The same work, published in The Conversation, had a completely different title. It says meat phosphine, a gas commonly used for industrial fumigation that can damage your lungs, heart, and liver. And that was picked up by newspapers across the world. It has a general audience, but you can really see how I've changed the words I used, such as lung versus respiratory effects, to make it more broadly accessible. And that's not all. So you also, in the Conversation article, I've done a much clearer job of telling the audience why it matters. And so when I show you the article which you received as one of your items, you can see that, just read the intro paragraphs of the Conversation piece. Not only in the title did I explain why it matters, which is causing damage to your internal organs, but I used 2 examples of harm to everyday people, and that's going to make people sit up and pay attention. And so you can see the introduction paragraphs. These were provided to you, but you can see the immediate impact on how people would be affected by this exposure. And if you had a chance to review the AAPS abstract, I did not make that as immediately impactful because I jumped straight into the science. And that brings me to my third point, which is tell a story. Use storytelling to make your case. And so stories are, there are a variety of studies that found that these stories can be, make it more likely that people will remember what you shared, are more convincing than just data, and can reduce counteraging. And third, they increase engagement. And that's because stories activate the parts of the brain that process information. And you can often, this has actually been scientifically studied, and you can see that process in MRIs that have been carried out. So that there are a series of references that I use to make these 3 accessible comments, and that's Grasser et al., Green and Brock from 2000, Neyman 2018, Dahlstrom 2014, Downs in 2014. But all of these published scientific studies really show how the brain changes when you make stories a part of how you're communicating. And that brings me to my 4th point, which is keep it focused and short. You really want to do that to make it much more accessible, and I'll provide you a justification of that. This is because we have short attention spans, and our attention spans are shrinking. Dr. Gloria Mark from UC Irvine has studied attention spans for over 20 years. In 2003, people could pay attention to a single screen for 2.5 minutes. Now it's just 47 seconds. If you're sharing information online, you have only 15 seconds until people will click away. So that means we have to capture their attention and get our main point across quickly, and that isn't easy. And so there's an apa.org article that talks about attention spans, and a website from Crazy Egg about why users leave a website that I got those 2 pieces of data from. And that brings me to my final recommendation, which is to prepare and practice. Get feedback and you'll get better over time. And so with that, I want to give you a chance to ask some questions, and I can answer them, but that really gives me the key points that I wanted to present within the time frame that I had allocated.
Thank you very much for the very practical advice. That's enormously helpful. Thank you. And if I remember correctly, you're not able to stay for the whole meeting. Is that correct?
I'm not, but I will stay for as long as I can answer any questions or that are needed. So I'll do what I can for that time period.
So if you have questions for Ali, please bring them up now. You can put them in the chat, or you can go to that link, or you can just unmute yourself. find opportunities to communicate with the general public?
So that is a really great question. So I think that there's a number of ways in which we can communicate with the general public. And I want to emphasize that at a higher level, at a higher administration level, we view communication with the general public as being of increasing importance. There are question marks right now of whether the public really understands the value of the academic enterprise. And a part of addressing that is really communicating what we do and why it's important. The ways that I have been able to reach out to the public and communicate with them have been both broad and localized. So, for an example, I met some Board of Regent members during the process when we were doing our presidential search, and I got to know them pretty well. And in getting to know them, they invited me to their clubs, their Rotary clubs, to give presentations, and then their friends asked me if I would come to their Rotary clubs, and so I said yes, I want to come and tell you about what I'm doing and reach out. And so I was in those Rotary clubs. These are not scientists. There was one or two, but these were really the broader public, and I was having conversations with them about the work we do and how it impacts the state of Iowa, but also the broader world. And those were great conversations, and it was a great way to fine tune the presentations I was having. I went to scientific cafes. So for an example, in Fairfield, there's a cafe there where we do a scientific cafe to present work on environmental health research. And it's in Fairfield. It does have a university, but not one that's part of the Board of Regents. We had a great audience there, people that just like to come and learn and listen, and it was a really great way to communicate. Those are local examples of speaking to the public, getting them aware of what we're doing and how it impacts the broader state. But at the national level, speaking to reporters can be a way of being able to convey the importance of science to the topic that they're presenting, or to bring through a breakthrough for them. I had a project on bone regeneration that was featured on Fox News and on ABC. And then it was also featured on NBC. And that was great because that was, I may be interpreting this wrong, but that was right, left, and central. And it covered a broad population. It was very impactful. And so that was great. I've written articles for The Conversation, which is really a news magazine that gets the word out to the global population about work that we're doing and the impact. That, I think, is a great way to communicate to the public as well. And so I gave you a couple of examples, both local and national, that can be ways of communicating to the public that are all just as impactful and meaningful in their different ways. But the local is just as important as the national.
We got a question in the chat. How do you reduce jargon and at the same time shorten the time required to explain the concepts?
That's a really great question. Thank you for asking it. And I think that the way that we can do it is to be thinking about the language that we use. So for an example, when I talk about the pulmonary exposure and then I'm trying to convey that to the public, saying lungs is just way more accessible. And that's a simple example of how you can change something from a complicated term to a more accessible term. And I think that there are many, many examples like that, that just trying to simplify the language, stop using really complex terms when we're looking for a public domain. Or even when I gave a talk to an elementary school once, the language I used was way, way simpler than what I was using when I was then going the following week to a conference. And so pitching it to your audience and tailoring it to your audience, I think, really makes a difference in terms of the language that you use.
Great. Other questions? Okay, well, thank you very much. And if any other questions come in, I'll forward those along to you. We can post the answers on Slack or something.
Yeah,
so,
I am using Slack, so I'll be happy to answer it that way. And I just want to express my gratitude to everyone that took the time to come and listen to this. Thank you. And it's good because it helps us to have an impact as well.
Yeah, yes, it does. Yeah. Okay, so our second topic is communicating with undergraduates. So this is building on Ali's description of the general public audience. And this is relevant to, if you're working as a CTE, that's what we call TAs in our department, or if you are working with an undergraduate researcher, or even once you end up in industry, you may be working with an undergraduate intern, right? So this is another important audience to work with. So I will let Monica take over.
Yeah, thank you, Laura. And thank you, Ollie, for some great insights on communicating with the public. So I'm going to talk about communicating with undergraduates, and I'm specifically thinking of the undergraduate audience that might be new to academic research or new to technical projects. As Laura said, it may be down the road in your career where you're mentoring an undergraduate intern. And I want to start first by explaining the framework that I'm going to, advocate for its use in these situations. So the framework is called Transparency in Learning and Teaching, and its acronym is TILT. And the website is there. It's TILT Higher Ed. This is a research-based framework to help instructors in higher education make their courses, their course content, and their assignments more accessible to the broad population of learners that we encounter in higher education. And again, their tagline is sort of making a small adjustment or a tilt in the way we prepare assignments can go a long ways towards increasing students' confidence in completing those assignments and their sense of belonging in higher ed. The transparency framework then has four tenets. You want to communicate in your assignment or in your instructions to students the purpose of the assignment, again, being transparent. So communicating the purpose of why you're asking them to do the assignment, and also communicate specifically, in your view, the knowledge that they'll gain from completing the assignment, and if it's applicable, the skills to be practiced as they do the assignment. And then being very specific about the tasks to be completed for the assignment. So this is something, again, that is evidence-based. There's many research articles and things at Tilt Higher Ed from the PI who's done this work. And so this is, kind of coming from the teaching perspective. Um, what I'm going to advocate for is that this is a framework that we can apply for onboarding students and introducing them to undergraduate research projects. I've been using the TILT framework as an instructor since 2019, and in 2020, I started applying the TILT framework to all of my undergraduate research projects. And so I've had many students come through my group by this point, and I've just seen amazing results. And so in the documents that I provided to Laura, I provided what I call an assignment sheet that and I'm just going to pick it apart here in this next few slides. So this is a sample assignment sheet that explains for an undergraduate research project, a first task that I'm asking the student to complete, or a first set of tasks to get them introduced to the project. And it's just showing you how I explain purpose, knowledge, and skills. Now, this is a framework. It can be customized. It doesn't have to come in the form of an assignment sheet. It can come within the context of the way you do things in your lab. I think the key parts is it doesn't have to look, it's not about the formatting or the document design, but it's about have you communicated the purpose and knowledge and skills. In this particular assignment, the student's going to be doing some modeling of nucleic acid aptamers. And so whether they've had a biochemistry course or not, I ask them to review nucleic acid structure and start their journey in reading the primary literature. And so I tell them, you know, in the knowledge section, you should be able to name the 4 bases in RNA and the 4 bases in DNA. So that helps the students know, like, well, I just took biochemistry, so I'm good there. So maybe, they're like, as long as I can do that, I've met the goals of the assignment. And again, just kind of promoting the skills that I'm hoping they'll get, that note-taking processes, summarizing scientific findings, that transcends what they're going to be doing here in the undergraduate research project. The tasks, I always get a lot of questions about the tasks. So again, I'm listing out specific tasks, and as they complete the tasks, it leads to specific and tangible deliverables. So I'm asking them, again, to review or introduce themselves to some material. I'm giving them very specific videos, specific pages to look at. I'm giving them a project overview. I'm giving them some reading assignments, but then I'm asking them to create PowerPoint summaries of those, and kind of talking to them about what each summary should include. Again, I'm not telling them what format, but I'm just saying, like, these are the things that you want to incorporate in your note-taking project, and how they're to submit it. So again, it gives them tasks, specific things they can do. Then they can take ownership of, again, completing this, project, getting started on the project onboarding tasks. So why would someone create assignment sheets for undergraduate research? Because if you think about it, like, the beauty of undergraduate research is it's not associated with a course per se. You're not sitting in a lecture hall, you're not completing homework. So why would you give assignment sheets? Why I'm advocating for this is students are used to the assignment language, if you will, or the assignment structure. We, in undergraduate research, we find the beauty of undergraduate research is it allows students to start to transition into independent scientists and engineers. But this bridges that transition, helps them bridge from sitting in a course with a syllabus and lecture hall and homework assignments, transition to having a bit of a structured approach at the start of their undergraduate research project. Again, it helps them monitor their own progress because they can look at the task, they can look at the purpose and say, like, am I meeting the goals of the purpose of completing this task? It helps improve students' skills with interpreting instructions, and using the framework, because you're being as transparent as you personally as their mentor can be, it encourages students to seek clarity, and identify where they may need additional resources before they start doing the work. I don't advocate for doing this all semester long or all summer long, for an entire term. I have found that just 2 or 3 of these assignment sheets at the start of a research project is enough to get students starting to think within this framework about their own work. So they start applying the framework and asking me questions about, it looks like what I should be gaining from this part of the study, or this is the question I want to address. It seems like I'm going to have to use this other software that I found, but we haven't talked about that yet. Do you know someone in your group or someone here that uses that software? So they quickly start to adopt the framework for structuring their own work. And that's really, again, what we want to do, because we want to help students structure their undergraduate research, or their internship work just in a way, that we would do, that we would have them do in structuring independent work in the workplace. And again, so this gives them a framework to follow and make their own. And so again, that's the TILT framework for thinking about communicating to undergraduate research or undergraduate investigators and getting them started in research. So takeaways, I again wanted to kind of tie into just what is it like to communicate with undergraduate students who are new to research or new to a new technical project. First thing is, I think it's always a good idea to be prepared for that first meeting. So as graduate students, one of the things you can do is, typically the student has had some sort of an interview or a conversation with the PI of the lab to express their interest and get the okay to start on the project, and then they might be assigned to you to mentor. So talk to your PI and say, like, oh, can I see their application if it's a summer research program, or can I get a copy of their resume, or just where are they coming from, and use that information to try to relate how you're going to introduce the project to them, relating it to what they know or what they've experienced. Again, it could be a course that they've recently taken. Again, I'll just use the biochemistry example, like, have they taken it or not? Where do you start that conversation about aptamer modeling? Depends on what courses they've had. Maybe they've had some prior internships, or just if there's something about your project that you can relate to everyday life, that's always a good starting place. Just amplifying Ollie's message, explaining why the research matters, is an excellent way to relate to any audience, including the audience of students who are new to research. I like to take it a step further and explain to the students why their contribution to the research effort matters. It does take some effort and some patience with undergraduate students. They are used to doing back of the book problems and getting an answer. And it might take multiple conversations with some students to explain to them that it's a journey, and research is a journey, and it's about contributing to the overall research effort and how their part is a valuable contribution. So again, the why does it matter, always applicable for all audiences. And then again, I would just encourage you to consider tilting in a way that makes sense for your context. Maybe some of the first few onboarding or training activities that you do with a student who's new to your research project, and include something tangible that they can deliver to you with each of those training tasks. I think nothing derails a new student's enthusiastic start than for someone to say, go read these 10 papers and I'll talk to you next week. They don't know what to do with it. They don't know the jargon. And so again, just a little bit of attention to those, tilting some of those first few activities, I think will go a long way. Well, I'll stop there and be glad to take questions.
Thank you, Monica. Well, somebody's submitted a question already.
Oh, excellent.
Is the TILT framework specific to undergraduates, or can it be applied to graduate or high school students?
Yeah, thank you for that question. It can be applied to all learners. I don't teach high school, but I would think it would be appropriate, but I use it in my graduate courses as well. Yeah, as well as the undergraduate research.
So once you get to the position of being a leader on a team, I often encourage graduate students in my lab to take on an undergraduate researcher, because they can practice learning people's strengths and weaknesses, right? But also, it is invaluable to practice explaining your project in a different way. You often have, connect key ideas that way of, you're trying to explain it to this undergraduate researcher, they're not going to tell you they don't understand. You're just going to get a blank stare for the most part, usually. So if you try explaining it a different way, and then a different way, and then a different way, you often will have some sort of new insight from those various explanations. So. Other questions for Monica? Can we get a raise of virtual hands of who's probably going to have a undergraduate research assistant working with them this semester? No? Maybe everybody else is walked away from the computer? No. Okay. Yes. Great. Okay, so it is now my turn, and I'm going to talk about funding questions. Zoom is prompting me to answer Monica's question, that she has her hand raised.
Oh, no, I was raising my hand for the...
I know.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay. No, you're fine. I got to get my screens worked out here. Okay, so this is kind of a hybrid of how to write a good proposal versus like what happens when you submit a proposal. And it's really hard to see the reviewer's motivations until you've been a reviewer yourself. And the exemplar document that I provided was our Chemurgy proposal, which the entire document is available in the Chemurgy all hands folder at any time. I did try to cut it down so that it wasn't 500 pages or however long that is. So some of the tips I'm going to provide are more applicable to standard research proposals. This was different in that it was for a center. And if you're planning to go to industry, not academia, that doesn't necessarily mean you're never going to need to write a proposal. There are SBIR funding opportunities, so Small Business Innovation Research, or STTRs, Tech Transfer Research. I forget what all these stand for. And I've been a reviewer on those proposals at least 5 times. I'd estimate more likely 10. And often the program officer would be asking us, panel of academics, can you please identify at least one of these that we could possibly fund, right? Because they were all so poorly written that none of us wanted to fund any of them, right? And they had a mandate to fund proposals, right? So it's important that you understand, even if you're not in academics, like what's expected in terms of these proposals. So, right, this is me. Okay, so the route from an idea to actual research, in an ideal world, you could just call up a program officer and tell them your idea and they'd give you some money, right? But really, the process of writing the proposal helps to refine the idea. And the peer review process really is fairly rigorous for the most part. It can be helpful as well. And regardless of whether your project gets funded or not, I always enjoy writing a proposal because I almost always learn something new, right? And then that sparks new ideas. So it's actually a chance to spend time looking at the literature as you write the proposal. Okay, so what happens, right? So you've got your idea here, you and your team, and there's this convoluted path where you and your collaborators work together to write the proposal. You're always going to have somebody who is the PI of the project, the primary investigator, and they're the one who's ultimately responsible for getting all those parts together. Depending on who else is on your team, you know, as you start working with people, you learn who's an awesome team member and who's only going to send their documents and make no comments, no reviews, really. So it's a chance to kind of give your team a trial run. But you and your collaborators, right, you write the proposal, and I'm going to go through a bunch of other stuff here. And then before you can submit it, it has to go through your institution's sponsored program office. I'm looking for the laser. Your sponsored programs office. And so this is just making sure that, like, you've used the right fringe rate. So if you're going to pay somebody's salary, there's a fringe rate that covers benefits. If you use the right tuitions, if you built in inflation, they're not going to critique your idea. They're just making sure that you're not getting them in legal trouble, right, by saying you're going to do something really crazy and not doing the right financial documents. Then once it goes through the sponsored programs office, then it goes through just a quick review at the funding agency. So this is the point where you can get returned without review, and that's always horrifying and embarrassing. That can be for something as simple as not using the right formatting for your bibliography, right? So this is heartbreaking. It's never happened to me, right? But it's hard to happen to other people that I know, right? If you've spent all this time and you're not even going to get review comments back because it's not going to get reviewed because there's some small detail that you overlooked. Then your program officer or whatever funding agency, you know, they've got multiple divisions and directorates and whatnot. They will do a preliminary check to make sure that it's aligned with the goals of that program, because they don't want to be asking, they have to work really hard to find reviewers, and they don't want to give a reviewer a proposal that has nothing to do with that project or with that funding program, right? So they do a preliminary check on that. Then you got your assigned reviewers. Typically, you'll have 3 people on the panel who are assigned to review your proposal. The first one and the second one, primary and secondary, and they know who they are. They'll do a thorough job for the most part. The third one is your tertiary reviewer. Now, for National Science Foundation, NSF, that person is the scribe. They're going to take notes during the panel. And they can get away with, and they all know it, during discussion of the proposal saying, I have nothing else to add. So they don't necessarily do as thorough of a review as the primary and secondary. And it's not like they're cheating, right? That's just understood. That's the role, right? So the third person won't review it as closely as the first 2. Then depending on the funding agency, DOE, NIH, NSF, DARPA, they all do these things differently. But that review panel will meet. And so your assigned reviewers will present their idea of, oh, I thought this was excellent, or no, I didn't really like this one, right? They'll talk about it for 5 or 10 minutes. And the scribe will take notes. You're going to get those notes back. You'll get the reviews back. And then you need a champion on the panel to really get funded. So unless all of your reviewers gave you the highest score possible, you're going to be somewhere in the middle, and you're going to need somebody when the review panel discusses rankings to say, what about that one? I really like that one. And that needs to usually give me one of your 2 reviewers. Other people may open the proposal and look at it, but really your champion's going to be one of your reviewers. So there's a degree of luck there in terms of how thorough and good and enthusiastic your 2 reviewers are. So the panel will make its recommendation. They don't decide funding, they just make recommendations. Then the program officer will, because there's more than one panel typically for any one funding call, until they'll have results from multiple panels, and they need to look through those and decide what's actually going to get funded. So that's up to the program officer, and now we're starting to have some mysterious forces at play, where there's some final person who's going to review these. And even before, like, so when we submitted the Chemurgy proposal, I've heard from someone else who submitted that they got all excellent, which we did not, and they didn't get funded, and we did, all right? And so there's always some other stuff at play there that you may or may not know why you did not get funded, even if the reviews are very positive, right? And so hopefully you get some funding at the end of that. Okay, so all this text, I'm sorry, right? Make the slides available. But essentially, right, so you need to read the instructions. You don't want to get it returned without review. So what is the required font? Not just the size, but what type of font, right? Usually there's 2 or 3 allowable font types. What are your margins? What's your spacing? We kind of had a panic the day we submitted this proposal because we did have it at like 1.5 spacing or whatever, but when we tried to upload it, it's only like 35 lines per page or something, and so we had to kind of scatter to get into back under the page limit. I've heard of people having their proposals reviewed because when their citation, they just had first author at all instead of listing every single author. So I know NIH has been strict about this in the past, right? So check the guidelines and make sure that all the required sections are there in your proposal, and not just like, oh yeah, we wrote about our team structure. Have the heading team structure if that is a required section of the proposal. Don't just have the responsive text, but show your reviewers, here's that part that's required. Supporting documents. These are just as important as your project description, especially if one of your reviewers just doesn't like your proposal and they can't really say why. They will go through and nitpick it to death. I love doing this, and I'm not embarrassed to admit that, right? But to find every single hole in what these reviewers said they were going to do. You could bring something down, right, if you're thorough enough. So your biographical sketches. This demonstrates your team is qualified to do the proposed work. Also, if you're submitting a proposal in 2025 and one of your collaborators sends you a biosketch to upload and it says some publication from 2020 and then it says submitted in parentheses, that's a sign of carelessness, right? You need to go back and ask your collaborator, hey, what about this manuscript you submitted in 2020? Was it published or was it not? Because this looks like this person hasn't updated their biosketch in 5 years. The publications that are listed and the activities, you're restricted to a certain number depending on your funding agency. They need to align with what you're talking about doing in the project. So especially people who are active in multiple research areas, they need to have the right set of publications listed. Your facilities and resources, does your team have the appropriate stuff to do the research? I reviewed a big center proposal once. They were going to be doing stuff with like pyrolysis of biomass, and nobody said that they had a pyrolyzer, and nobody was asking to buy a pyrolyzer in their budget and budget justification. So there's no way they were going to be able to do that work. And yeah, they probably had a pyrolyzer, but nobody said they did. So you got to be careful. Current and pending, this is not in that exemplar document, right? But this is a chance, really it's a chance to check for carelessness and sloppiness, right? But do people have projects listed that ended in 2023? And here it is, you're submitting this proposal in 2025, right? So that needs to be up to date. Each project that's funded needs to have a statement of how it does or does not overlap with the proposed work. So that needs to be tailored for every single current award relative to each proposal. So this is not just here, take my old data, my old version of this file and use it. No, it needs to be tailored for this project. I can't tell you how many people. Okay, never mind. Your budget and your budget justification. Again, I didn't include these, but this needs to align, right? If you have described 3 graduate students worth of project in your project description, you need to have funding for 3 graduate students. Right? If you're going to do stuff at core facilities, you need to have facility user fees listed. If you're going to buy something, some new equipment, you need to have that listed and it needs to be justified. So this is a chance for a reviewer to go through and poke holes in your story. Letters of support, we'll talk about this a little bit, but basically, and the different funding agencies have different restrictions on these, right? But are you really planning on working with this outreach group, or are you just saying you're going to do it? Having that letter there gives you an additional level of credibility. So each of these demonstrates to your reviewers how careful your team is and how thorough, how well organized. Review every single thing that you get from your collaborators, right? Don't be afraid to send it back and say, hey, can you update this, right? Because you probably care more about this proposal than they do, right? And it's up to you to submit the best proposal possible. Okay, next slide. Okay, so your project description, right? If you have 15 pages, use 15 pages. Don't submit a 10-page project description, right? It looks bad. Aim to have at least one figure and table on each page. If the bibliography doesn't count towards your page limit, which usually for a full proposal it shouldn't, don't be stingy, right? Assume every reviewer, the first thing they're going to do when they open your proposal is search for their last name. You don't want to be doing work that is adjacent to what somebody else has done and not cite that person, because they're going to be annoyed from the very beginning. All right, they're going to be looking for problems. So don't be stingy. I usually aim for 100 for each standard proposal. I think the Chemurgy proposal had 200 or so. Explicitly state your project goal. Don't leave it to the reviewer to interpret that. So here's some quotes from the proposal, right? Our vision is this. outcomes from this include, or our goal. And if you're citing your own work, say that. Don't just say, this has been done before. Say, our group has done this before, and then cite your work. If you're showing a graph or a table with experimental data in it, put in that legend, this is data from our team, right? Don't expect your reviewer to say, okay, that's citation number 19. I'm going to check the bibliography and see what it is. And oh, look, those authors are the people who submitted the proposal. No, just tell them, this is our work. We did this. Okay. Your reviewer is probably an expert only in your general subject area. So I often get asked to review things about like additive manufacturing, which is not my research area, right? So they can comment on the general quality of the research plan, but don't assume it's somebody who typically would read your manuscripts or your publications, right? So you need to explicitly tell them why your work is important, why it's novel, and why it's likely to be successful. So if you look through the proposal, we have these sections for each of the focal areas. And it's really nice to walk away from a proposal having learned something as a reviewer, right? So if you can teach your reviewer something along the way, they will appreciate that. It's a nice feeling. Right. Explicitly align your project description with the program goals. Early in my career, I had several proposals in which the reviewer said, this shouldn't be funded because it's high-risk research. When the project call said, we want to fund high-risk research. So you need to put in your proposal, this aligns with the project program goals because it is high-risk research, right? So don't assume that your reviewer is up to date on what the program criteria are, because those change frequently. All right, so here's an example of where we said in the proposal, right, this activity aligned with strategy 6 in our S&T plan. So that's showing that one, we align with our S&T plan. The S&T plan, the science and technology plan, was part of the proposal. It was right there. We didn't need to tell our reviewers what was in the S&T plan. But also, this was like an 800-page proposal, right? So we can't expect them to go dig that up and see how things align. So we told them explicitly, it does align, and here's the part in which it does align. So both the blue part and the red part were important. We could have just said the activities proposed below will promote blah, 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 blah. Or we could just say it aligns with strategy 6. But saying both parts makes it easier on the reviewer to see how that alignment. If there's a lot of space for technical descriptions in the project, which there's not in the Chemurgy proposal, right, you should come up with at least one possible failure point for each of your sub-aims and then describe how you're going to work around that. So it shows that you've thought about it and you know what could possibly go wrong. Highlight the connections between subtasks. You're almost always going to have 3 aims. And if you have to successfully complete aim 1 before you can do aims 2 and 3, no, because they're going to give you all this money for these 3 things. And if the first part fails, what's everybody else going to be doing? What's going to happen with the rest of that money? So if you can have at least some degree of parallel, aims 1 and aims 2 will work in parallel, and then they'll feed together into aim 3. Something like that is better. Because you also don't want 3 completely isolated projects either. So you need some degree of connection, but it also needs to be likely to give some sort of research product, even if one of your aims fails. Okay. Put in a diagram of your project structure, right? Aims 1, 2, and 3, and this is how they're connected. Put some names on there, right? This should be like on the first or second page of your project description. Explicitly state over and over again who's doing what, right? And this will be cross-checked against the biographical sketches and the budget. If you say that so-and-so is going to supervise a graduate student to do aim 3, you need to make sure that graduate student is represented in the budget and the budget justification, right? So say this again and again. Read your final proposal out loud before you submit it. I did it with our proposal, right? It makes it easier to find mistakes, and reviewers understand grammar. I don't think I've ever reviewed a proposal without a single mistake in it. But if they're getting annoyed, they will point out that there are mistakes, and it'll be embarrassing. Right? Okay. Your letters of support. I left a few examples in that exemplar document. Again, the funding agencies vary in terms of what you can include. I think we had almost 30 letters of support. But again, this is supporting evidence that you are more likely to do what you're saying you're going to do. Okay, so the exemplar document has three types of letters in there. One is boilerplate, where they all basically say the same thing, but they have different letterheads and signatures. That's showing that we know people, right? I could reach out to this person and ask them to sign this letter, and they did. So we've got some industry connections. The second kind is supportive of project feasibility. So for example, we said that Florence Williams' lab was going to be doing some work with corn stover, and we proved that we have a source for that corn stover. we've got a letter from this person who works out at the Biosensory Research Farm. Yes, I'm going to provide this much corn stover for this work. We've thought through, right? That little task is done already. We've identified a source for that corn stover. And then evidence that the things you have promised in the proposal that other people are going to do, evidence that they know that you promised that and they agreed to that. So for example, we said we're going to hire this professor of practice, we're going to support them, and then the ABE department was going to take over that person's support over time. So we've got the chair of the ABE department saying, yes, I know that they have promised I'm going to do this, and I agree. All right, so it's just supporting documents. So the more you have, the better. But they need to, if you have letters of support that have a different project title in them rather than yours, you're just reusing them from a previous proposal. No, that's going to make things even worse. You're not helpful. Okay, so to summarize, right, read the program guidelines and the funding agency requirements early. That should be the first thing you do, right? Don't write your project description and then realize you missed all this stuff. The supporting documents are just as important as the project description. Review everything that people send you. It matters more to you than to anybody else, right? And so you're responsible for what's in those documents. Your reviewers are general experts in your subject area. Make it easy for them to review, hopefully teach them something. As a reviewer, like one of my worst nightmares is showing up to a panel and saying, this is a great proposal. I really think this should be funded. And then reviewer 2 lists all the things that are wrong with the proposal that I overlooked, right? That's a disaster. That's embarrassing, right? And so people will err on the side of being lukewarm relative to risking expressing enthusiasm for something when they didn't do a thorough review, right? And so you want multiple levels of demonstrating to your reviewer that this is a solid proposal that is worthy of support. Okay, so just keep in mind your proposal should document that this research, if successful, will be somehow further the goals of the funding agency, that your team has the qualifications and experience to successfully perform the proposed work, that you have the appropriate facilities and resources to do the proposed work, and that the amount of funding that you're requesting is adequate, right? You don't want to propose 5 graduate students worth of work and then only ask for funding for 1. It may be a great idea, but you're not going to be successful if you don't have a large enough team to do that. Okay. And proposal development is a test run for your team. If you have a horrible collaborator, you don't need to write any more proposals with that person, right? It's probably going to be not a good collaboration, right? So this is a chance to see who you work well with. And it's also a good opportunity to learn more about your field. So it usually leads to some new project ideas. Okay, and I probably went way long. I will take questions. Stop sharing. Okay. Questions. I have plenty of horror stories. Those stick out, right? The people who made terrible mistakes when they submitted their proposal. I've done this.
There's one in chat, Laura.
Something's in the chat. Would it be a good idea to reduce jargon to make reviewers understand better and always focus on the big picture or simply go scientific? So there's a sweet spot, right? Generally, your reviewer is going to be a general expert, right? They're not going to know everything you're doing. But sometimes you may get one person who is your direct research competitor and they want to pick you to death, right? And if it's really that complicated of a relationship, they should not be reviewing, but it's up to the individual people to declare a conflict of interest or not. So you want to do both, right? In terms of you need enough jargon and scientific terms in there to demonstrate that you know the research area. But no reviewer is going to show up and say, I don't know enough about this. That's not true. They're not going to admit that they don't understand what you're doing. They'll say they don't understand the plan or something, right? But you don't want to put the reviewer in the space of saying, I'm not educated enough to do this. Does that make sense? Yeah. And we talked about things getting returned without review. Nothing makes a reviewer happier than realizing that a proposal is not compliant and they don't have to review it, right? So they're going to check all those things too in terms of the page limit and all these things, because if they can go back to the program office and say, I'm not going to review this one, it's not compliant, you can just reduce your workload, right? And so they're going to take advantage of that opportunity also. Okay, next. We have intellectual disclosure / communicating with investors from our first Eric of the day, Eric Cochran.
Hey, hello everybody.
Hello.
Well, in true professor fashion, I was working on slides up to the time of the thing.
Yeah.
Let's see. Okay, I think I want this on a different monitor. Hold on a second. All right, are we good? Good. All right, so I've got quite a bit of experience in this realm, I guess. So there's really a lot of there's a lot of information to share, and so for 10 minutes, I'm giving a very high level overview because this ends up being a pretty complicated topic, and there are so many there's so many pitfalls and ways that you can step on rakes that it's just ridiculous. Anytime you intersect science with the world of legalities, things can get complicated. So communication and patents is very important because that's ultimately the first step in making the product of your research commercially valuable. So communication matters because you're going to be talking or writing to several different audiences, some very technical, some very legally proficient, and others very business proficient. And the type of information that's important within the context of patents and intellectual property changes quite a bit from audience to audience. And you, as the scientist, will have a lot of learning to do the first time that you go through this type of communication. So patents are kind of a trade. You're giving away your secrets to the world, which we're used to doing as academics anyways, right? So when we publish a paper, that's what we're doing. We're telling the world all the great things that we've done, and it's out there in the public domain. In a patent, what you're doing is you're giving the world your secret recipe, and in return, the government is giving you a monopoly. They're protecting you from competition up to the 20-year lifetime of that patent, if and when it issues. And the reason why the government makes that trade is that if there was no protection for new inventions, then there would be no motivation for inventors to share what they've come up with. And then there's always the risk that that information will be lost permanently at some point when that inventor moves on. So public research that doesn't have any protection is almost never going to have commercial value because the great result that you can get published in Nature and Science might be all well and good, but there are a lot of details that need to be worked out in order to translate what you can do in a laboratory or research environment into a product that can be put on a website and sold. And so who's going to want to spend millions of dollars in doing all that risk taking if at the end of the day you just got something on Amazon that anybody can come in and duplicate and take advantage of all that investment that you've made and drive you out of business? And that's happened. It's happened with ISU originated inventions. I remember there was a foot massager called the O-Ball that came out of Iowa State, and I actually bought one because I have terrible feet, and it worked great. But it went on to Amazon, and there were a lot of copycats, and I don't know officially if they've gone out of business or not, but I can't find them anywhere anymore, which is too bad because I think they had a superior product. But for whatever reason, it wasn't protected well enough to keep them from copycats. So communication becomes important then because whether it's you or somebody else that wants to license your intellectual property, if the patent isn't done correctly, then you have those risks, and a lot of money can be invested and then lost, or nobody's going to want to take the risk to make the investment in the first place. So it all starts with knowing when you have a disclosure. And the disclosure is the first step. And so at Iowa State, that would go to the Iowa State University Research Foundation, or ISERF, or if you're in a company or at a different university, they'd have similar similar departments, organizations that you would first make an invention disclosure to. Once the disclosure office decides that they think you've got something that's worth showing to a patent attorney, at Iowa State, all the patent attorneys are going to be external. If you're in a company, they may have in-house patent counsel, or they may not, depending on how large the organization is. Getting that research result turned into an effective patent requires you to understand what patent language is and why things are worded in a certain way, and how especially the claims are written in order to protect what it is that needs protecting. Once you have the patents, or assuming you have a successful patent application and you're trying to market that, whether that's to secure translationally oriented research funding, or if you have a startup company and you're starting to get ready to talk to investors, or you're trying to encourage a larger company to license your technology, the companies are going to need you to be able to communicate how your invention is going to be able to make money and over what timeline, and how much investment is that going to take. And so each of those communication styles are going to be quite different, because the background of the individuals you'll be talking to will vary quite a bit. And the important parts of your message are also going to vary quite significantly. So the first component of this whole process then starts with the invention disclosure. And so this is a fairly informal process. So the details of it are going to vary amongst organizations. And this process is going to go much better if your documentation throughout the research process has followed best practices. So a lot of groups like to have fairly strict management of laboratory notebooks, because if they're well dated and things are well documented in there, it's very easy to tie down an invention to a date. There are a lot of different ways to do it. We can talk a little bit about that as we go through it. So at ISU, the main things that you'll see on our invention disclosure document, which is called IPDR here, are going to be answers to the obvious questions. So what's it called? What is it? So the title needs to be a non-enabling title, because the university will want to try to market your disclosure if they decide to move forward on it. And so they're going to need a title that they could share publicly without threatening the patent. And there's also going to be a description of the invention that shows how it's useful. You're going to provide some supporting evidence, and ideally that could be a manuscript that you're ready to send for publication. At this stage, it doesn't have to be that far along, though. We often will start disclosures as soon as we're sure that we've got something that we think might be useful as a patented technology, and we'll just get a flag in the ground by attaching a confidential slide deck or some other more informal research result along with the invention disclosure, just to document that we've got the goods and there's a lot of details. So the legal thresholds that you have to meet for a patent basically come down to: is it useful, is it novel, and is it non-obvious? Is it non-obvious? These things should at least be intimated in the initial disclosure, and you'll eventually need to go more deeply into it as things progress. Who sponsored the research is very important. If you'll have far greater patent rights if the technology was funded internally or with state funds versus other funding sources. If it was company funded, there may be certain rights provisions there. If it was federally funded, there's the Bayh-Dole Act, which grants certain rights to the government. So that's documented in the disclosure. So here's an example of a title and a brief description from one of our disclosures. So this isn't a supplemental documents that Laura's collected. So an example of a non-enabling title is shown here: compostable core shell particles for impact modification of rigid plastics. So it says what it is. in pretty plain language, but it doesn't tell you anything about how it was done or what kind of materials were done. And for a brief non-confidential summary, it's short enough. I can walk through it with you. We start with one introductory sentence. So familiar, ABS plastic is familiar to most people. So that's an example of an engineering thermoplastic. So this type of material must be impact modified to attain the requisite fracture resistance. And so these are important materials and they appear in all these places. So ABS, for example, has this huge market. And so that's telling the disclosure office and a prospective investor in the technology that's surveying university research foundation websites for things that might be interesting, that we've got this thing that could be useful in everyday life, and there's a $30 billion market. So that gets to kind of the financial aspects of it. And what's the good stuff is we disclose novel compositions and processes for compostable core shell particles that are useful for the impact modification of rigid plastics. And in the tail end, we explain why that innovation is important. So here we're hinting at novelness, or novelty and non-obviousness. And here we get into the utility. So the state-of-the-art modifiers, we're admitting that particles like this already exist, but they're non-compostable. And so when you mix something that's non-compostable with a compostable matrix to make it better performing, you're ruining the value proposition of that material by adding all these microplastics. And so we're claiming that we're showing how to fix this problem. And then the rest of it is pretty straightforward. So one of the important things is you need to have something like a signed lab book that shows when was the first time you thought of this. And we do a lot of stuff in Slack in our research group, and so that was very easy for me to pin down an exact conversation where this happened the first time. And you can see it, a screenshot of that if you actually open up the full document. As far as the initial supporting evidence, we literally just attached a slide deck from one of our presentations to the sponsors, showing what we had done and why we think it's exciting. There's not a lot of language or text or narrative yet here, so this is just a flag in the ground style initial disclosure. The rest of the disclosure gets into some of the other aspects of it. So who contributed and how. So in the disclosure document, these people are called contributors because the designation inventor is a legal designation. Now, most often, the patent office and the disclosure office are going to accept your proposed contributors as inventors. That facility of being able to suggest who the inventors are ends at that disclosure. So if you think of somebody later, or somebody later contributes to the invention, and you think they have earned the title of inventor, it's a much higher bar to get them added later. It generally will require far more documentation of what they did and how it satisfies inventorship criteria, and will often end in an interview with the university's patent attorney. Another component that's important is you need to give an exhaustive list of what you think might be the best examples of prior art. What can you steelman the patentability of your disclosure? And the reason for this is that patent law requires you to disclose the best prior art examples related to the application. If you intentionally omit something, then you can have your patent application invalidated, or in the nightmare scenario, you could have an accusation of perjury if you say there's nothing and then the examiner finds something that you could have reasonably expected to have been aware of. For example, if your student goes to the ACS and gives a talk and you don't disclose that, that's a big no-no, and you've got to correct that immediately if you have an oversight. And then the who paid aspect is repeated there again. I'll comment briefly on inventorship versus authorship. So in a university environment, most groups tend to be pretty inclusive with authorship. So if you had an undergrad in the lab that was a great helper, they're generally going to end up being on the article. somewhere in the middle author range, especially if if they're looking to go to grad school and you want to make sure they got a great CV. That's usually fine and usually meets authorship criteria. That's not necessarily going to cut it for inventorship, however. Very simply, inventor is somebody that contributed in a material fashion to the invention's conception. So you can come up with the idea of nuclear fusion, right? And so if you conceive of a new way of doing it easily or economically, or conceive of some major innovation that makes that easier, you're an inventor, even though you haven't done squat in terms of showing that your idea actually works. So the reduction to practice part of it is the second half. And so that's actually taking that great idea and then the praxis of that. An inventor has to have some role in both. So your superstar undergrad that does all the experiments you propose and does a great job of collecting and even interpreting the data might have really earned their spot as an author. But if you can't come up with a credible argument as to what they did that actually contributed to the conception of the invention, you're probably going to be told no, they don't qualify as an inventor, especially if you're trying to add them later on beyond the initial disclosure stage. So once you get through the initial disclosure and the disclosure office has agreed that it's worth pursuing a patent application, you're going to start working directly with the patent attorneys. And the things that they're going to want to be able to develop is what are the newness of the disclosure, how is it useful, and then is it non-obvious? And the non-obvious criteria is there's a few nuances to understand. The main one is its obviousness as applied to a person of ordinary skill in the art. And that's a term that comes up so often that a lot of attorneys will just throw the word posita around without bothering to explain it. So you've seen it here first now. Posita is a person of ordinary skill in the art. And so that what that means depends on the field. But if it's a polymer related patent, then a person of ordinary skill in the art would probably be somebody with a PhD in a polymer related area. So it has to be non-obvious to somebody like that, and which is a much higher bar than showing that it's non-obvious to a third grader. Once you get the patent application assembled, there's a whole other slew of decisions that the inventors may or may not be involved with. The first one is, what countries are you going to file in? So the rules for filing in the US only are slightly different and slightly more forgiving to technologies that have had some public disclosure. Depending on what it is, international coverage might be important, which is far more expensive and far more complicated. So at Iowa State, they're just not going to go for an international filing unless they've got somebody on the hook already as a licensee to pay for the costs. If there is a licensee, if that's you as the lead entrepreneur in a startup company, you've got a couple of years, but you're going to need to be able to pick which companies or which countries you think you need coverage in. And that's a very important business decision because things get expensive rather quickly if you choose too many. And the order in which you do things is going to change a bit as well. If your technology was developed and patented by a university, and if that happens in the near future, that's probably going to be the case, you're going to see your patent attorney trying to get you to claim the world. So if you invent a penne noodle, they're going to try to write a claim that says a food product comprising flour and egg. And they're going to try and get that to stick. And so not only are their claims going to be very broad, there'll probably be a very large number of them. We've had applications over 100 claims, which gets to be in the ridiculous level. Most of the time, they're going to be over 20, which is a lot, often over 30. And the reason for that, as argued by the university side, is we don't necessarily know what market or what industry is going to take value from this patent. So we want to make sure that all the bases are covered. Now you contrast that to what the industry strategy most often is they generally know exactly what the market potential of an invention is, And they're going to save a lot of money in the development of the patent by having a more narrowly tailored patent application. And so that trade-off is the breadth. We don't know what market versus we really have a very specific commercial purpose for doing this. Throughout the patent process, and that can take several years, the inventors are incredibly important, especially in very technical patents. The disclosure office won't be able to get the patent across the finish line on their own. They need you. And you can remember that at the end of the day, if you don't think you have any leverage. That patent isn't worth anything without the support and knowledge of the inventors. So the first thing that you're going to do as an inventor in helping that patent go across the finish line is the attorneys need a good starting point. And in ISU, in the old days when there was a lot of royalty revenue, in certain cases they would pay the big bucks to have an attorney take napkin scribbles and random presentations from group meeting and turn that into a patent application. That's quite expensive to have them do that from scratch. It's far more cost efficient if they have a full draft manuscript, at least nearly in the shape where you'd be comfortable sending it in for peer review. So you got to have that manuscript ready. You don't need it at the disclosure stage, but if they want to file, you're going to have it ready by then. Depending on what the technology is, the non-obviousness of the invention might not be easy for the patent attorneys or the disclosure office to see. The inventors are going to need sometimes have to dig into the prior art and show what specific aspects of what this cool research result actually qualifies this as non-obvious. And patent attorneys love to see the word surprising. And so I highly encourage you when you're writing disclosures to use the word surprising, or if you're asked why is this non-obvious, why is this non-obvious, to think about how you can use the word surprising. I'll show you an example on the next slide. The attorneys, once you've gotten past that initial analysis of whether you have anything that's patentable or not, the attorneys are going to take what you've given them and try to come up with claims. They're going to push those claims back to you, and you're going to have to be able to read and interpret those claims and then make your own assessment. Is this good enough for protecting this invention for commercial development? If they interpreted it wrong, you're going to need to comment up that draft and probably have a teleconference with them to explain what it is that you think is wrong about it. And a lot of times what you think is wrong might just be a gap in your understanding of how patent law works. And that's two-way communication there. And that's where a lot of your education and how this whole system works might come from. You'll learn the distinction between things like dependent and independent claims, or product claims versus method claims. So this is one example from this one disclosure that serves my exemplary documents, where core shell particles are very commonly known. And so why are our core shell particles novel or surprising? And that doesn't mean it's the idea of having a compostable one is cool. What patentable aspect of that can we come up with? And so then you get into the details and you come up with reasons. And so you'll see peppered throughout that document, whether you want to get into the technical aspects of it or not, is the word surprising. Once you get past the initial application, a couple years later, it'll get examined. And one of the first things in the patent examination is going to be a restriction requirement, especially in a university patent. So they're going to say, well, you've got 100 claims, we're only going to examine 10. So pick which 10. And so your input is going to be necessary there. And then they're also going to be there's going to be an objection to claiming a pasta product comprising flour and egg. They're going to say that's way too broad. And there's all these examples of why that's not going to work. So can you narrow that claim down to something? And that's okay. And a lot of patent attorneys will make that initial claim overly broad initially, just because they want to see what they're going to get away with. The next part of the application, once you've approved the claims, is going to be what we call the specification. And so that's the body of the patent, and that's going to have the introduction and a whole bunch of definitions and then a whole bunch of examples. the specification is really important because later you're going to need to modify claims to get your patent across the finish line. One of the big rules in what you're allowed to do when you modify claims is you can't introduce anything new that doesn't already exist in the specification. So if your initial claim doesn't have a temperature range, for example, and the examiner comes back and they say, well, this new thing that you did is done in the literature, and here it is. And you say, well, they're doing it at 300 degrees C, and we did it at room temperature, so ours is clearly better. And the examiner might agree with you. They probably will. But they're going to say, is there anything in the specification that supports that? And if you don't have that in an example or somewhere in the spec, that would qualify as you're trying to introduce new art, and that wouldn't be allowable. And so that's why the specification becomes important. And then the rest of your manuscript is going to turn into what we call the examples section. And it's the examples where most of the enabling happens. And the reason why thorough data sets are wonderful is because that, again, gives you the maximal ability to tweak your claims later to navigate around what the examiner cites against you as prior art. The final part of this, which will be brief.
Eric, if you've got like 5 minutes.
Yeah, this is almost over.
Okay.
Is communicating with companies and investors. And the reason why this is relevant is because the whole point of the patent is translation of technology and commercialization. So what your companies and investors are going to want to know is, first and foremost, how is this technology going to make money? Should be obvious, right? And then you have to be able to translate the scientific wonderfulness of it into where's the market fit for this? What's the business case? How are you going to, is it going to be, it's great technologically, but can you mass produce it? If you mass produce it, what's it going to cost? Is it going to be competitive? What are the competitive technologies? If all that works out, is it ready to go? Is this turnkey? Can we just spin up an existing plant and start making this? Or are there scale-up problems that have to be solved? Are there supply chain problems that have to be solved? What are those development milestones? So you've got to be able to think about that and share it in a way that makes sense to the stakeholder you're communicating with, which is going to be far different if it's a venture capitalist versus a tech scout at a large chemical company. Sometimes larger companies will just want to come and license a technology, or maybe they're not ready to license yet, but they want to sponsor a small little research project to take it a little bit closer to a lower risk point for further commercialization. And it's really these stakeholders that the filing strategy becomes important with, because again, that domestic versus foreign filing has a lot of costs associated with it. When you're in this phase, just be really careful about public disclosures if you don't have a provisional application filed yet. And in that provisional year, you have the opportunity to add more to the patent for when it converts from a provisional into a full patent application. If you're coming up with new stuff in that year, you don't want to disclose that without an NDA because you won't be able to add it to the new patent if it's public. You don't soil the bed, so to speak, with what's already in your original provisional application, but you're going to want to be able to update that provisional at the end of the year, and so you got to be careful with that. So that's it for the brief summary. So my key takeaways from you are if you think something even has a shot at being patentable, you want to get that disclosure in right away, because it does take disclosure offices up to several months at times to get to your case and decide if it's got legs. Remember to add everybody that you want added as an inventor early, because it's very hard to add them later. And remember that lab helpers aren't going to qualify as inventors. So if there's an undergrad that you think deserves inventorship, make sure you're able to justify that according to the inventorship criteria. Remember useful, not obvious, and new, and surprising to apposita for patentability. Remember that international coverage is very expensive, and you're going to need to be willing to be on the hook for that as an entrepreneur, or convince your large corporate partner to pay the big bucks to get that international coverage. Remember that you as the inventor, if you want that patent to succeed, you've got to be ready to stick with it for the long haul. And finally, if you're looking for funding, remember that companies and investors fund products that make revenue, not papers and patents. So that concludes what I had to say.
All right, thank you. If people want to submit questions in the chat, please go ahead and do that. But let's move on to our well, okay, we got one question here. Eric, Cochran, if you could answer that question in the chat. I think we need to move on to our next speaker, Eric Hagberg, joining us from our advisory. Where did he go? Oh, there he is. Okay, yeah, sharing his slides. Okay, we're talking about industry as our last audience, and then we're going to talk about this year's SciComm partnership activity. But please go ahead, Eric.
Yeah, so can you guys hear me? I hope.
Yes.
Excellent. So yeah, so I guess I get to go last year, and it's probably good that I go last, because I think I can do maybe reviewer 3 and just say I have nothing to add. All that all matters. It all fits into this, right? But it really, but it does. Everything you just heard from all the other topics are a fit within. Are tied to this, and that's really because industry is kind of a microcosm of everything you just saw. And I sell you in industry or communicating to industry, I would really look at a lot of things you saw as various tools or various pieces of what you need to do. As a scientist in industry or engineer in industry, you're going to be besides the science or the engineering, the big part of your job is communicating. Right. Because we are always going to be a team. You're rarely going to be working alone. You're rarely going to do anything alone. And the only way all this stuff kind of fits together and works together is through sharing the information, which is communication. Right. So kind of obvious statement there, but I think it's worth saying, because all of the things that Ali talked about, all the things Eric talked about, all of the things that Laura talked about, all the things that Monica talked about, all fit into this and kind of weave together into this web. So the first thing, if you are in a technical role, especially with an advanced degree, you will be, day one of your job, you will probably be doing almost all of these things. Right, and maybe within the first month, you'll probably do a lot. You'll do a lot of them, and that includes even things like grant. As we heard of them, I write a fair number of grant proposals. I'm not on a huge number of peer-reviewed publications, but I'm on peer-reviewed publications, and that's same with our team. But if you look at this overall, where you spend most of your time, email is the industry standard, remains to be the industry standard. Instant messages, we spend a lot of time there with information moving back and forth between team members. We also spend a lot of time in reports and presentations, right? So you think about where, like all the things we're doing, they're all for a different purpose, all for a different audience. And that's where a lot of the stuff you just heard and how it all fits together. And you have to think about why, who, how to communicate it, and what's the best format. So, and again, I'm not going to belabor a lot of things here, because I think you've heard really good summaries on a lot of them, but general guidelines, right? So, the big 3 things I said are around emails and those instant message type communications, reports and presentations, and then your meetings, right? So, and don't forget about meetings as a communication vehicle, because that's where we spend a lot of time in industry. And I think, or if you're working with industry, where you're going to spend a lot of time. There's some general guidelines that govern all of that. Again, we heard that in Ali's presentation about who are you presenting to, right? Are they technical peers? Are they business colleagues? What's the expertise? What's the background, right? So every time you go to send an email, every time you go to put a presentation together, every time you write something, who are you writing it for? What's the audience, and what are the background? And that comes into the statements about jargon, use of jargon, how to use jargon, right? Should you be at all, or should you be trying to find some simpler way to explain it? Then comes the communication format, right? So, and this is one that lots of people, get mistake a lot on, right? So you'll get emails that are 50 pages long, and it's like no one's going to read that. It's going to get ignored or deleted. It's just because it's not the right vehicle, because no one has time. Emails are meant to be a quick scan, and that's something we forget a lot. If you need to convey that level of information, it needs to be in a presentation, a written report, or probably a combination of all 3, of a presentation in a meeting plus a written report, right? So yeah, so you got to think about what you're trying to convey, what's the purpose, and who's the audience. One big one that's really easy, and I'm glad I got to present my own slides, not the ones I sent to Laura about an hour ago or a couple hours ago, because proofread. And you got find those mistakes, get those out of there, because I mean, as I was sitting, I was scrolling through things, I was finding and fixing things. So yeah, don't submit something that has mistakes in it, right? Read that email a second time before you send it. Use spell check, use grammar check, and in the modern world, if you've written it already, I mean, no one should feel ashamed of throwing it into if you have an AI tool in a company, it needs to be a proprietary AI tool, can't be the public one, but throw it in there, double check it, make sure it reads right. I mean, it's easy. We've got all sorts of things that help us convey our point more clearly. And the last one, and this is probably the most absolute, important thing to communicating in industry or to industry, is brevity and clarity. And so I had fun with the point here. Don't obfuscate your point with verbosity and overly complex, explanations that run on and on and on and on and on. You get a lot of that. Technical folks often like to show how much we know, and that tunes people out very, very quickly. So be brief, be clear. Think about what your point is. Now, it comes back to all the points above that. Maybe running through these kind of things. Reports and presentations. A lot your work is generally to be summarized in reports and presentations. So keep about who's it for, who's it going to, and then think about in presentations. Think about the time. How much time do you have? How much time do they have? Right, so that can be a disaster to a project or something, to just because you didn't take into account the fact that stakeholder has limited time to spend on it, and you didn't get your whole story, and they canceled the project, or then the company misses an opportunity just because you're not good at time management, right? That's a real thing in industry, especially. A big one, I think this came up in a couple other points, but start off with the ask, right? So start off with the conclusion, right? So put that up front so everyone knows why, and clearly what the value, right? So there's some art to doing that without giving away some things, because telling a story is important, but also with short attention spans, putting it up front, making sure people clearly understand the value of it. And then I will say, don't use acronyms. I will say, be careful how you use acronyms and jargon. Right, they have a purpose, they have a place. It can be part of how you be brief and how you be concise. But think about who's think about that audience, right? So are they going to follow? Are they going to understand? Does the acronym or jargon actually help tell your story or help with that explanation? Again, we make emails and meetings is what we suppose a lot of time, but structured. That's your message up front. That's scannable or it's supposed to be quick, right? So one page, right? Try to get your email so it fits on one page. That should be succinct. And then a big one that I think people think, going from where you're more of a private individual, right, to where you are in industry and you're kind of tied to another entity, is be careful about what you write. Anything that you write it gets archived often. There's records that go back. They can pull up email exchanges. They can pull up instant message exchanges. That stuff is all discoverable if a court case comes up. So never write anything that you wouldn't want before it did, right? I mean, so obviously things that are confidential, ideally stay confidential, but there are mechanisms, places where some of that stuff will come to light. So you never write anything that is personally or professionally embarrassing, right? That is a very that is a cardinal rule that people really need to be thinking about. And then, proofread your message. You think about if you're going to use humor, think about how you're going to use it. Going back to the point above about being careful, and then then things like all caps, right? I mean, that's a little bit. I think more people are a little more mature than that, but for most part, but that still happens every once in a while. You get an email yelling at you in all caps, and that's just. And I take the privilege just hitting the delete button on those. So if I happen to get one, so. Meetings, make sure make sure if you're going to schedule a meeting, make sure people know why they're in the meeting. Make sure you got notes and somebody's set up to take notes and take actions. Close the loop, follow up on the actions. And then again, time comes in. The time comes in a lot. Is think about the audience and who needs to be there and how much time is required. What I have next is a couple of examples here, and I've got a fictional email here to Dr. Jarbo. Not really telling where it's come from, but thinking about you're seeing there's some professional interaction here in this, right? So you read the one on the left, right? So this is kind of fairly typical of a lot of emails that people dash off quickly. Hey, I'm going to take my dog to the vet. Not a big deal. It's going to I'm headed to Des Moines. got some errands to do, things are going well, so no big deal. Oh yeah, by the way, here's the draft, right? And it's like, right, that doesn't what's the point of this email? Well, is it the draft? Is it the fact? Is it trip you're going to Des Moines, right? So think about when you write that email, say, hey, I need you to review this draft. We've got a chance to get this submitted for this special issue, like that. And if the trip to Des Moines that it happens to be somewhat relatively connected to it isn't tied to Dr. Jarbo, don't tell her about it. It just doesn't need to be in there, right? So, and this happens. I think probably the faculty here can tell us, but this happens a lot. You get a lot of emails like this. The ones that are formatted more towards the one on the right are very much appreciated because you can look and say, okay, I know what I need to do, right? So, and you think about, if you think about people, a lot of people like my job, we get lots of emails every day, right? So thinking about how you structure the email can help get your point across. It helps us and get what you want done is the big thing about it. Meeting invites, another one. This is just a suggest. This is something we use on our team. It's basically every meeting invite that goes out has what we call the 4 Ps. That's got purpose, the preview of the meeting, how we're going to run the meeting, and then what we're going to accomplish in the meeting, right? So, and then we've got some tied into OneNote and some actions to make sure we're doing things about closing the loop. And it's best practice to propose to at least put an agenda in there. Maybe you may have to change on the fly, but have a plan at least. So, and I would give 2 thumbs up to Laura's meeting invite on this because it fits all of these criteria. So. And then I think there's kind of maybe one example here of kind of a little bit of a concise project overview that's meant to be kind of in the middle of that chart I started off with in terms of conveying a whole bunch of information, but trying to be as concise and brief as possible. Maintain, kind of get when people have that short attention span, how to get the information where, that they need to see. Like you think about this, when I put this up in front of a business colleague, where do you think their eyes go? If you're thinking they go to the bottom lower half corner, that is exactly where they go. The first thing they look at is, well, how much money? The second thing they're going to say is how long it's going to take to get there. And that goes to the timeline, right? So, we're trying to put it up in a way that engages people to think about what the project is, why is it why is it valuable? And it's a quick reminder of the project, and we can go through and give updates on projects really quickly with this. Without and we don't have to, and it's not we don't have to go into detail, but we can go into detail if need be. So. With that, I really, meant to, again, it was awesome to have all the other people hit a lot of the points. So I guess I get to kind of reinforce a lot of them, but it's critical industry. It's critical everywhere. But it's thinking the fact that we do everything in teams. I don't know any company that doesn't do everything as a part of a broader team, because you can think it's not just your technical expertise. It's people in regulatory, it's people in legal, it's people in accounting and finance, right? So you have to tune your communication to fit for everybody's background, everybody's expectations. And you're going to be communicating to make everything work. You're going to be communicating across that broad group. So think about who they are and what you need them to do. Make sure you make that put that statement up front. Be brief, be clear, and details needed at times, but only go into that detail as it's required or the situation warrants. Like if you're writing a technical transfer report that's going to go to the plant operation folks, you probably need to be pretty detailed. But if you're giving an update to the business on the project, you probably don't need to explain how you came up with a new pulse sequence to finally figure out what that impurity was in the NMR, right? So that's right. That's you've got to think about who they are and or do they care. And then the last thing is, and this is really important, is be professional. Again, I know people who have had things they have written end up in court. They're tied to and they're discoverable as evidence, things that end up out in public in the press, things that end up, things that get spread on social media. It can be damaging to the company, but also damage to your own career. So yeah, that's what I pulled together. I'm happy to grab some questions, and maybe I caught you up on time a little bit, Laura. So
you did help with the time, and thank you. This was really great. All the presenters have done an excellent job of, I've learned a lot just in the last hour and 45 minutes. So this has been enormously helpful. In the interest of time, let's put some questions in the chat if people have those, but I'd like Taylor to go ahead and talk about the SciComm partnership activity to make sure we cover that. And like last fall, we are expecting all Chemurgy funded graduate students to participate in the partnership activity. This is a chance to put some of what we've been talking about into practice. And please go ahead, Taylor.
Great. Are we seeing my slides here? Okay, awesome.
Yes.
Thank you. So I'll keep this super brief. So I'm going to talk about the Science Communication Partnership. The first question that you might be asking is partnership between who? So I teach in the English department, and the primary class that I teach is called Communicating Science and Public Engagement. So we have undergraduate students from across the university, although they primarily tend to be from CALS, who are taking this class to learn about a lot of the stuff that we're talking about in, in this workshop even. So they are sort of the first set of partners, and y'all are the other set of partners. The goal here is to bring you as Chemurgy grad students into the class a couple of times as sort of touchstones. The other thing I'll say about the undergraduates who are taking this class, in terms of like the level of research that you are doing, I would consider them non-experts. A lot of the students that are taking this class are majoring in biology, vet med, animal ecology, those sorts of things. So they might be interested in additive manufacturing, maybe, but don't necessarily have that level of expertise that you might run into if you're talking to somebody at a conference or something. So that's who we'll be working with. The next question you might be asking is why? Nope, why? And as we've talked about today, the idea here is that you will, through this partnership, be able to better articulate those broader impacts of your research that is important to the larger kind of Chemurgy objectives. And that through this partnership, you'll have some quick opportunities to exercise those skills in talking about your research with non-expert audiences, and that you will ideally be able to walk away with a couple of tools in your toolbox to help distill those complex ideas for a more general audience. Okay, so what will we actually be doing? Now we get to this. There are really 3 points that I want to kind of, 3 touchstone points that we'll have throughout the semester. So that the next step that we'll have is to assign you each to one section of the class. So there are 3 sections. 2 of them are in person at Iowa State. 1 of them is virtual. So we will kind of work with you, figure out what is your availability, what is the modality that's going to work, and we'll probably have a little bit of mix and match based on just how many people are coming from Iowa State versus other universities. Our first meeting time will be Tuesday, September 16th, where we'll work with narrative and metaphor and do a class discussion there. On October 21st, which is another Tuesday, we'll do what I'm calling a co-feedback day. And then a big event, which is a major assignment that the students will be working on throughout the semester, called Science with Cyclones, will be in November. And for folks in Ames, we'd love to have you come out to that as well. So on Tuesday, September 16th, the objectives that I'm going to ask you to sort of pursue, the things that I want you to kind of come in with, I'll send you an article to read, the same article that students are working on that day, called Uniting Science with Storytelling. And this is in line with what they're doing for the first 4 weeks of the class, which is thinking about how narrative and storytelling are useful as science communicators. And in this part of the science communication class, they will also be like working on incorporating story into their cover letters and personal statements. So you'll read an article, you'll come to class, and this will be a relatively laid back class discussion. What I want you to come prepared with is being willing to talk about your research journey. What has your story as a researcher looked like? And that'll be a key focus of the class discussion. The other thing I want you to come prepared with is a metaphor. So there was a question asked early on in the workshop, like, how do you take a lot of complex stuff and talk about it easily without jargon, without explaining too much? Well, metaphor is a great tool to do that. An elegant metaphor will do wonders. So think for yourself about what might be an effective metaphor that you're already using or might be able to use to distill that complexity in your research. Come prepared to talk about your research journey, and I will again send that reading, which should help set you up to think about how to frame your research journey. So that's the first touchstone. That's the first day we're meeting. The second day is what I'm calling the co-feedback day. So on this day in October, students will just be starting to work on their Science with Cyclones project, kind of bringing together individual components they're working on to talk about a science topic with a younger audience. The age range is like 8 to 11 for that event. So they're just going to be started to work on that. What we're going to do is pair each of you as an individual with a group